Imagine a sleepy college town where the flicker of a police badge promises safety under the moonlight until one officer's hidden world shatters that illusion with a single, horrifying act. In Columbia, Missouri, a vibrant young student's life is snuffed out in a way that defies belief, exposing a secret so explosive it rips through a family, a police force, and an entire community. Whispers of betrayal and forbidden passion echo in the shadows, but the truth, it's darker than anyone could fathom. Who was this officer, and what drove him to cross a line no one saw coming? This isn't just a story, it's a descent into a true crime mystery that will grip your soul and keep you guessing until the very end. Stay with us, because what happened on that fateful night will haunt you long after the credits roll. Hit that subscribe button and let's dive into the unknown together. In the spring of 2004, Columbia, Missouri was a vibrant college town home to the University of Missouri, where students like Jesse Valencia chased big dreams against a backdrop of leafy streets and lively campus life. Jesse, just 23 years old, was a junior studying pre-law and journalism, a young man with a future that seemed boundless. To know Jesse was to know someone who could light up any room. Charismatic, quick-witted, and fiercely authentic, he had a way of making everyone feel seen, whether he was debating politics in a classroom, cracking jokes at a party, or just listening to a friend over coffee. His smile was infectious, his energy magnetic, and his ambition undeniable. Jesse grew up in Prairieville, Kentucky, raised by his single mother, Joan Valencia, who poured everything into giving him a life full of opportunity. Joan was his rock, and their bond was unbreakable. She often spoke of Jesse's determination, how even as a child he'd set his sights on big goals, whether it was acing a school project or standing up for what he believed in. Jesse was openly gay, a truth he embraced with courage, even in a small town where acceptance wasn't always guaranteed. He faced prejudice head-on, never letting it dim his spirit. By the time he arrived at Mizzo, Jesse was ready to carve out his place in the world, dreaming of a career in law where he could advocate for justice, or in journalism where his sharp mind and love for storytelling could shine. In Columbia, Jesse lived in a modest apartment just off campus, a hub for his tight-knit circle of friends. He was the guy who'd organize impromptu movie nights or lead debates at the local coffee shop, always with a spark in his eye. Friends like Andy Schermerhorn and others described him as the glue of their group, someone who could be both the life of the party and a shoulder to lean on. Jesse's openness about his identity made him a beacon for others in the LGBTQ+ community at Mizzo, where he quietly supported friends navigating their own journeys. He wasn't just a student, he was a presence, someone who left an impression on everyone he met. But Jesse's life wasn't without its struggles. Being openly gay in a conservative-leaning college town in 2004 came with challenges. He'd faced whispers, judgment, and the occasional hostile stare, but Jesse refused to hide who he was. He balanced a demanding course load with an active social life, often seen at local bars or campus events, where his charm made him a favorite. He worked part-time jobs to support himself, determined to ease the financial burden on his mother. Those close to him noticed Jesse's knack for seeing the good in people, even when they didn't deserve it, a trait that made him trusting, sometimes to a fault. As spring turned to summer in 2004, Jesse was looking forward to a break from classes, planning to spend time with friends and maybe take a trip back to Kentucky to see his mom. He was in high spirits, unaware that a seemingly minor incident, a run-in with the law at a rowdy college party, would pull him into a dangerous orbit. That moment, in April 2004, would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would lead to tragedy. Jesse's life, so full of promise, was about to collide with a secret that would change everything. Who was the person who entered his world, and why would their connection turn deadly? That's where this story takes a dark turn. It was just after dawn on June 5, 2004, in Columbia, Missouri, and the quiet streets near the University of Missouri campus were stirring with the soft hum of a summer morning. Joggers were out, birds chirped in the trees, and the world seemed peaceful until a passerby, walking along a grassy lawn on Wilson Avenue, stopped dead in their tracks. There, partially hidden by overgrown grass, was a sight that would haunt them forever: the lifeless body of a young man, sprawled unnaturally, his skin pale against the morning light. It was Jesse Valencia, the vibrant 23-year-old student whose laughter and dreams had filled these streets just hours before. His throat had been slashed with such vicious force that the wound nearly severed his spine, a brutal gash that spoke of rage and precision. Bruises on his neck told a grim story. He'd been choked, likely rendered unconscious before the final fatal cut. The discovery shattered the calm of that June morning, and word of the horror spread like wildfire. The passerby, shaken to their core, called 911, their voice trembling as they described the scene to dispatchers. Within minutes, Columbia Police Department officers swarmed the area, their patrol cars lining the street as yellow crime scene tape went up. The lawn, just blocks from Jesse's modest apartment, became a grim focal point. Detectives in plain clothes arrived, their faces grim as they surveyed the body. Jesse lay face up, his eyes open to the sky, his clothes disheveled but offering no immediate clues. The scene was eerily clean: no murder weapon, no footprints, no obvious signs of a struggle beyond the marks on Jesse's body. Investigators noted the precision of the attack. The chokehold, strong enough to leave deep bruising, suggested someone with physical strength and control, while the throat wound, deep and deliberate, hinted at a killer who knew what they were doing. As news of the murder reached Jesse's friends, shock turned to devastation. His close friend, Andy Schermerhorn, got a call from another friend and rushed to the scene, only to be stopped by police barriers. Tears streamed down his face as he realized the truth. Jesse, the guy who'd been joking with him just days ago, was gone. Other friends gathered at Jesse's apartment, clutching each other, trying to make sense of the unthinkable. They remembered Jesse's warmth, his plans for the future, and the way he'd made every moment brighter. One friend, Sarah, later told reporters she'd seen Jesse the night before, laughing at a bar, full of life. Who could do this? She kept asking, her voice breaking. The question hung heavy over everyone. The Columbia Police Department worked quickly to process the scene. Forensic teams combed the lawn for evidence, collecting hairs found on Jesse's chest and scraping skin from under his fingernails, signs he'd fought back, however briefly. These samples were carefully bagged and sent to the lab for DNA analysis, a process that would take weeks but held the promise of answers. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking residents if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. Most reported a quiet night, though one neighbor mentioned hearing a muffled argument around 2 a.m., too vague to pinpoint. The lack of immediate witnesses frustrated investigators, but they knew this wasn't a random act. The brutality, the closeness of the attack suggested something personal. Back at the police station, the case was already making waves. Columbia wasn't a town used to violent crime, especially not a murder this gruesome. The local newspaper, the Columbia Daily Tribune, ran a front-page story, and whispers spread across campus. Was this a hate crime, targeting Jesse because he was openly gay? A robbery gone wrong, or something more intimate, tied to someone he knew? Jesse's mother, Joan Valencia, was notified in Kentucky, and her anguished cries over the phone echoed through the police station. She couldn't fathom who would want to hurt her son, the boy who'd called her just a week earlier, promising to visit soon. One detail stood out to investigators, though it wasn't public yet. Among the first officers at the scene was someone who knew Jesse, someone who identified his body with a strange mix of detachment and unease. This officer didn't volunteer much, just confirmed Jesse's identity and stepped back. Was it just the shock of seeing a familiar face, or was there more to it? Detectives made a note but didn't press yet. Meanwhile, the community grappled. With fear and grief, students held a candlelight vigil outside Jesse's apartment, leaving flowers and notes on the lawn where he was found. "We love you, Jesse," one read, scrawled in marker on a piece of cardboard. The town was reeling, and the pressure was on to find answers. As the sun set on June 5th, the crime scene was cleared, but the questions lingered. Who could commit such a vicious act against someone like Jesse? What drove them to such rage? And why was the scene so clean, almost calculated? The answers were out there, hidden in the shadows of Columbia's quiet streets, and the investigation was just beginning to uncover a truth that would shake the town to its core. The investigation began with the basics. Detectives set up a command center at the police station, pinning photos of the crime scene to a bulletin board and mapping out Jesse's last known movements. They started with his inner circle, interviewing friends, classmates, and neighbors to build a picture of his life. Jesse's openness as a gay man led to early speculation: could this be a hate crime, a targeted attack fueled by prejudice? But the precision of the murder, the choke marks, and the deep throat wounds suggested something more personal, not a random act of violence. Investigators leaned into this angle, asking friends if Jesse had any enemies, any relationships that had turned sour. Most shook their heads, still in shock, but a few mentioned Jesse had seemed distracted lately, talking vaguely about a guy who was causing him stress. No names, no specifics, just enough to make detectives curious. At the crime scene, forensic teams had collected crucial evidence: hairs on Jesse's chest, skin under his fingernails, and traces of biological material that suggested a struggle. These samples were rushed to the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab for DNA analysis, but results would take weeks, a frustrating delay in a case that demanded urgency. Meanwhile, detectives hit the streets, knocking on doors along Wilson Avenue and surrounding blocks. They asked about strange cars, unfamiliar faces, or noises in the night. One neighbor recalled hearing a heated exchange around 2 a.m. on June 5th, possibly near Jesse's apartment, but it was too vague to pinpoint a suspect. Another reported seeing a man walking quickly away from the area in the early morning hours, but the description: medium build, dark clothing, was too generic to be actionable. The lack of clear witnesses was maddening, but the team pressed on. The breakthrough came about a week into the investigation from a source close to Jesse. Andy Schermerhorn, one of Jesse's best friends, had been wrestling with grief and guilt, replaying their last conversations. Andy remembered something Jesse had told him: a fling with a man who wasn't just any guy, but someone with a badge. Then, one day, Andy was at a local diner, flipping through a newspaper with a story about the murder, when he froze. A photo of Columbia police officers at a community event caught his eye, and one face stood out. He called a friend, then the police tip line, his voice urgent. Andy revealed he'd once walked in on Jesse during an intimate moment with this man, someone he now recognized as an officer. When shown a lineup of department photos, Andy pointed to Stephen Rios, the same cop who'd arrested Jesse at that April party and who'd been one of the first at the crime scene. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation, a police officer as a person of interest. It was almost unthinkable, but detectives couldn't ignore it. They pulled Rios's records and learned he'd been on duty the night of the party where he arrested Jesse for obstructing a government operation. They also found something else: phone records showing multiple calls between Rios and Jesse in the weeks after that arrest, calls that tapered off just before the murder. Detectives brought Rios in for questioning, keeping it low-key to avoid department gossip. Sitting across from him in a small interview room, they noted his calm demeanor, his hands steady as he denied any personal connection to Jesse. "I arrested him once," Rios said, his voice even. "That's it," but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease when pressed about his whereabouts on June 4th and 5th. He claimed he was home with his wife, Libby, and their newborn son, but something about his story felt rehearsed. Investigators dug deeper, pulling Rios's duty logs and cross-checking them with Jesse's movements. They found overlap times. when Rios was off duty but near campus close to Jesse's apartment. They also interviewed other friends, one of whom recalled Jesse mentioning a cop who kept showing up unannounced, someone Jesse was starting to pull away from. The pieces were coming together, but the team needed more than circumstantial evidence. They pinned their hopes on the DNA results still pending and began tailing Rios discreetly, watching for any slip-ups. What they noticed was a man unraveling. Rios called in sick more often, seemed distracted on patrols, and was spotted lingering near Jesse's old apartment as if drawn back to the scene. The community, meanwhile, was growing restless. The Columbia Daily Tribune ran daily updates, fueling speculation about the killer's identity. Students at Mizzo held rallies, demanding justice for Jesse, their signs reading "Find Jesse's killer and no more silence." Rumors swirled, some whispered about a serial predator, others about a scorned lover. The police department faced scrutiny, with reporters asking why no arrests had been made. Behind closed doors, tensions were rising. Some officers defended Rios, insisting a cop couldn't be involved, while others wondered if they'd missed red flags. The investigation was no longer just about finding a killer, it was about confronting the possibility that the enemy was within. As June turned to July, the detectives waited for the DNA results, knowing they could make or break the case. They kept their focus on Rios, whose calm facade was starting to crack. Little did they know, his next actions would raise even more questions, pulling them closer to a truth that would shake Columbia to its core. What was Stephen Rios hiding, and how far would he go to keep his secrets buried? The answers were coming, and they would change everything. By late June 2004, the investigation into Jesse Valencia's murder was tightening around a man who, to the outside world, seemed an unlikely suspect. Stephen Arthur Rios, a 27-year-old officer with the Columbia Police Department, was the picture of stability, a married man, a new father, a cop with a promising career. But beneath that polished exterior, a different story was emerging, one of secrets, lies, and a life spiraling out of control. As detectives zeroed in on Rios, the pressure began to expose cracks in his carefully constructed facade, revealing a man caught between duty and desperation. Who was Stephen Rios, and what was he hiding that could connect him to a crime as brutal as Jesse's murder? Rios had grown up in Columbia, a local boy who'd always dreamed of wearing a badge. Friends from his high school days described him as disciplined, ambitious, and a bit of a perfectionist, someone who thrived on structure and respect. After graduating, he joined the police academy, earning his place in the Columbia PD in his early 20s. By 2004, he'd been on the force for several years, known for his cool-headedness on patrol and his knack for diffusing tense situations. To his colleagues, Rios was reliable, the kind of officer who followed protocol and kept his personal life private. He was married to Libby Sullivan, a kind-hearted woman who'd supported his career, and together they'd welcomed a son just months before Jesse's murder. On paper, Rios had it all: a family, a steady job, a future, but there was another side to him, one he kept hidden from everyone. That side came into focus when detectives learned of his affair with Jesse Valencia. What began as a chance encounter at a rowdy college party in April 2004, when Rios arrested Jesse for obstructing a government operation, had spiraled into a series of secret, passionate meetings at Jesse's apartment. For Rios, the affair was a dangerous thrill, a stark contrast to his structured life, but it came with risks. As a police officer in a conservative town, exposure could mean the end of his career, his marriage, and his reputation. When Jesse, disillusioned by Rios's lies about being married, began pulling away and hinted at exposing the affair, the stakes skyrocketed. Detectives believed this threat was the spark that could have driven Rios to panic, to do something unthinkable to protect his secrets. As the investigation closed in, Rios's behavior began to raise red flags. Detectives had questioned him early on, and his initial denials, no personal connection to Jesse, just a routine arrest, were starting to unravel. Phone records showed late-night calls between him and Jesse, some lasting only seconds, others longer, painting a picture of a relationship far beyond professional. When confronted with Andy Schermerhorn's witness account that he'd seen Rios and Jesse together in an intimate moment, Rios's composure slipped. He admitted to the affair, his voice low, but insisted their last meeting was amicable, that he'd left Jesse's apartment hours before the murder. "We talked, that's it," he told detectives, his hands fidgeting slightly, a detail they noted in their reports. But his alibi was shaky. He claimed he was home with Libby, but she couldn't fully corroborate his exact whereabouts, citing the haze of new motherhood. What really alarmed investigators was Rios's behavior outside the interview room. Just days after Jesse's body was found, colleagues noticed him acting off distracted during shifts, quieter than usual, his eyes darting nervously when the murder came up in conversation. Then came the first chilling incident. One evening, Rios was found in his patrol car, alone in a secluded parking lot, holding his service shotgun to his chin. A fellow officer intervened just in time, talking him down, but the episode sent ripples through the department. Was it grief, stress, or something darker? Rios brushed it off as exhaustion, claiming the pressures of fatherhood and work were getting to him, but detectives weren't buying it. A second incident followed weeks later when Rios climbed to the edge of a downtown parking garage, threatening to jump. Officers coaxed him down, but the scene was public enough to fuel whispers. To investigators, these weren't just cries for help, they were signs of a man buckling under the weight of guilt. At home, Rios's marriage was straining. Libby, still adjusting to life with a newborn, noticed her husband growing distant, snapping at small things, staying out late without explanation. She later told friends she'd sensed something was wrong but couldn't pinpoint it, chalking it up to the demands of his job. Rios's parents, proud of their son's career, were also in the dark, though they noticed his mood darkening. Meanwhile, the police department was grappling with its own unease. Rios was one of their own, a brother in blue, and the idea of him as a suspect was divisive. Some officers defended him, insisting he was being targeted unfairly, while others quietly shared stories of Rios's temper, moments when his calm facade slipped, revealing a man capable of anger. Detectives kept their focus on the evidence. The DNA results from the crime scene, hairs on Jesse's chest and skin under his fingernails, were still pending, but they were building a timeline. They re-interviewed Jesse's friends, who confirmed he'd been uneasy about a relationship, mentioning a man who wouldn't leave him alone. One friend recalled Jesse saying, "He's got too much to lose," a cryptic comment that took on new weight in hindsight. Investigators also learned Rios had been near Jesse's apartment on the night of the murder, despite claiming otherwise. His patrol logs showed gaps, moments when he wasn't responding to calls, and a witness placed a man matching his description in the area around 2 a.m. The net was tightening, but without the DNA, it was still circumstantial. As July wore on, Columbia buzzed with tension. The Columbia Daily Tribune ran editorials questioning the police department's transparency, while students held vigils for Jesse, their grief now mixed with frustration. "We want justice," one organizer said, holding a candle outside Jesse's apartment. Inside the department, detectives worked late, poring over evidence, knowing Rios was their best lead, but wary of accusing a cop without ironclad proof. Rios, meanwhile, seemed to sense the walls closing in. He started avoiding certain colleagues, his once confident stride replaced by a haunted look. By July 2004, the investigation into Jesse Valencia's murder had reached a fever pitch in Columbia, Missouri. The Columbia Police Department, under scrutiny from a restless community, was zeroing in on one of their own, Officer Stephen Rios. The 27-year-old cop's secret affair with Jesse, a 23-year-old University of Missouri student, had been exposed, and detectives were piecing together a case that was as compelling as it was shocking. The evidence was mounting, and every new clue seemed to tighten the noose around Rios, but could they prove he was a killer, or was he just a man caught in a web of bad choices? The answer lay in a delicate dance of science, witness testimony, and a suspect's unraveling lies. The cornerstone of the case was the forensic evidence collected from the crime scene on that grim June morning. Hairs found on Jesse's chest and skin scraped from under his fingernails, evidence of a struggle, had been sent to the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab. When the DNA results finally arrived in mid-July, they were a bombshell. The samples matched Steven Rios. This wasn't just circumstantial, it placed him in close physical contact with Jesse at the time of the murder. The hairs likely pulled during their final encounter, and the skin, suggesting Jesse fought back, painted a vivid picture of a violent struggle. Detectives knew this was the kind of evidence that could sway a jury, but they needed to build a narrative around it. Prosecutors worked closely with the investigative team to construct a motive. Jesse had threatened to expose the affair, a friend confirmed, recalling a conversation where Jesse said he was tired of the secrecy and considered telling Rios's superiors. For Rios, a married father and police officer, the consequences would have been catastrophic: his career ruined, his family fractured, his reputation in tatters. The prosecution theorized that this threat pushed Rios to a breaking point, leading to a calculated act of violence. The choke marks on Jesse's neck, indicating he was strangled unconscious before his throat was slit, suggested a killer with control and intent, possibly someone with police training who knew how to subdue a victim. Witness testimony bolstered the case. Andy Schermerhorn, Jesse's friend, was unwavering in his account of seeing Rios and Jesse together, his memory vivid despite the emotional toll of losing his friend. Another friend, Sarah, told investigators about a late-night conversation where Jesse expressed fear, saying the man he was seeing had a lot to lose and was acting possessive. These accounts painted Rios as a man desperate to keep his double life hidden. Detectives also uncovered inconsistencies in Rios's alibi. He claimed he was home with his wife, Libby, on the night of June 4th, but phone records showed a call to Jesse's phone at 1:37 a.m., placing Rios near the crime scene. A neighbor's vague report of an argument around to a.m. added weight, though it wasn't definitive. Rios's behavior post-murder was another damning piece of the puzzle. His two suicide attempts, first with a shotgun in a patrol car, then threatening to jump from a parking garage, were seen as signs of guilt, not just stress. Detectives learned from colleagues that Rios had been erratic, missing shifts and avoiding eye contact when Jesse's name came up. One officer recalled Rios lingering near the crime scene days later, staring at the spot where Jesse's body was found, as if haunted by it. The prosecution argued this wasn't the behavior of an innocent man, but of someone wrestling with the weight of what he'd done. The defense, however, was gearing up to fight. Rios's attorney argued the DNA only proved intimacy, not murder. Given their admitted affair, the skin under Jesse's nails could have come from earlier encounters, they claimed, and no murder weapon, a knife or blade, was ever found. They also pointed to Jesse's active social life, suggesting other potential suspects, ex-boyfriends, casual flings, or even someone targeting him for being openly gay. But these arguments felt thin against the mounting evidence. Detectives found no other viable suspects, and Jesse's friends insisted he had no serious enemies. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by Rios's police training. He knew how to restrain someone, how to leave a clean crime scene, how to cover his tracks. As August approached, the Columbia community was divided. Some couldn't believe a cop could be a killer, while others, especially Jesse's friends, demanded accountability. The Columbia Daily Tribune published editorials calling for transparency, and students organized protests outside the police station, their signs reading "Justice for Jesse." The pressure was immense, and on August 15, 2004, prosecutors made their move. Steven Rios was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. As he was led into the Boone County courthouse in handcuffs, his face stoic but pale, the town watched in stunned silence. The evidence was strong, but would it hold up in court? In May 2005, the Boone County Courthouse in Columbia, Missouri, became the epicenter of a trial that gripped the town. Stephen Rios, the once respected police officer, stood accused of the first-degree murder of Jesse Valencia, a vibrant student whose life was cut short in a brutal act. The courtroom was packed, reporters scribbling notes, Jesse's family clutching tissues, and Rios's wife, Libby, sitting quietly in the back, her newborn son in her arms. The stakes were high. A conviction could mean life without parole, while an acquittal would leave Jesse's killer free. As the trial began, two narratives emerged, one of a desperate man driven to murder and another of a cop caught in a web of circumstantial evidence. The question was, which story would the jury believe? Prosecutors laid out their case with precision. They started with the DNA evidence, hairs and skin linking Rios to Jesse's body, placing him at the scene of the crime. They called forensic experts who testified that the choke marks and throat wounds suggested a controlled, deliberate attack consistent with someone trained in restraint techniques like a police officer. Andy Schermerhorn took the stand, his voice steady but emotional, recounting how he'd seen Rios and Jesse together, confirming their affair. Another friend testified about Jesse's fear, how he confided about a man who was too intense, someone he wanted to break things off with. The prosecution painted a clear motive, Jesse's threat to expose the affair to Rios's superiors, a move that would have destroyed his career and family. They pointed to Rios's suicide attempts as evidence of guilt, arguing that only a man, haunted by his actions, would try to take his own life twice. The most damning moment came when prosecutors played a recording of Rios's police interview. His initial denials, followed by his reluctant admission of the affair, sounded rehearsed, his voice wavering when pressed about his whereabouts on June 4th. They highlighted the 1:37 a.m. phone call to Jesse, contradicting his claim of being home, and presented a timeline. Rios, they argued, went to Jesse's apartment, strangled him, and slit his throat to silence him forever. The courtroom was silent as they showed photos of Jesse's injuries, a stark reminder of the violence. Joan Valencia, Jesse's mother, sobbed quietly, her pain palpable as she heard the details of her son's final moments. The defense fought back, arguing the case was built on speculation. Rios's attorney, a seasoned litigator, admitted the affair but insisted it didn't make Rios a killer. The DNA, they argued, was expected given the relationship, and the skin under Jesse's nails could have come from an earlier, consensual encounter. They questioned the lack of a murder weapon, asking how a cop trained in evidence handling could leave such a clean scene if guilty. They called character witnesses Rios's colleagues, his parents, who described him as a devoted officer and father, incapable of such a crime. Libby, though separated from Rios by now, testified about his stress as a new dad, suggesting his suicide attempts were cries for help, not confessions. The defense also tried to cast doubt by pointing to Jesse's social life, hinting at other potential suspects, though they offered no concrete names. The trial wasn't just about evidence, it was a clash of emotions. Jesse's friends filled the gallery, wearing buttons with his smiling face, their anger simmering as they watched. Rios, stone-faced, at the defense table. The police department, meanwhile, was under a microscope. How had one of their own gone unnoticed? Some officers attended the trial, their presence a quiet show of support for Rios, while others stayed away, embarrassed by the scandal. The Columbia Daily Tribune covered every twist, with headlines like "Officer on Trial, Murder or Misjudgment," fueling public debate. The community was split. Some saw Rios as a scapegoat, others as a betrayer hiding behind his badge. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 10 grueling hours. The tension in the courthouse was electric, with Jesse's family holding hands and Rios staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. On May 20, 2005, the verdict came, guilty of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. The courtroom erupted. Joan Valencia collapsed in tears, while Libby sat frozen, her face pale. Rios was sentenced to life without parole plus 10 years. a punishment that felt like justice to many but left others questioning. Had the jury gotten it right, or had emotion clouded their judgment? As Rios was led away, his eyes met his wife's for a fleeting moment, a silent exchange no one could decipher. But this wasn't the end. The case was far from over. The conviction of Stephen Rios in May 2005 should have brought closure to Jesse Valencia's family, but justice is rarely that simple. In 2007, the Missouri Court of Appeals delivered a stunning blow. Rios's conviction was overturned. The reason? Hearsay evidence, specifically testimony about Jesse's fear of Rios relayed through friends, had been improperly admitted, violating legal standards. The ruling sent shockwaves through Colombia, reopening wounds for Jesse's loved ones and reigniting debate about whether a killer had been caught or a man wrongfully convicted. As a retrial loomed, the case took on new life, and the question of justice hung in the balance once again. The appeal decision was a gut punch for Joan Valencia, who'd spent 2 years grieving her son while believing his killer was behind bars. She spoke to reporters outside the courthouse, her voice trembling but resolute. Jesse deserved better than this. "We'll fight again." The ruling also divided the community. Some, including Rios's ex-wife, Libby, and her parents, saw it as proof of his innocence, arguing the case was built on shaky ground. Others, especially Jesse's friends, felt betrayed, fearing a murderer might walk free. The Columbia Daily Tribune ran op-eds debating the legal technicality, with some calling it a necessary check on justice, others a loophole that favored the accused. In 2008, the retrial began, and the atmosphere was markedly different. The prosecution, wary of past mistakes, streamlined their case, focusing on the DNA evidence, hairs and skin linking Rios to Jesse's body, and the timeline of his phone calls and whereabouts. They avoided hearsay, relying instead on Andy Schermerhorn's direct testimony and forensic experts who reiterated the controlled nature of the attack. The motive remained the same: Jesse's threat to expose the affair, a risk Rios couldn't afford. They also emphasized his suicide attempts, painting them as admissions of guilt, though they tread carefully to avoid overstepping. The defense doubled down on their narrative. Rios, now gaunt and quiet, took the stand, a rare move, he admitted the affair, his voice soft, and insisted he loved Jesse, that he'd never hurt him. "I was at home that night," he said, his eyes fixed on the jury. "I'm not a killer." His attorney hammered the lack of a murder weapon and suggested the DNA was inconclusive, a byproduct of intimacy, not violence. They called Libby, who testified about Rios's devotion as a father, though their marriage had ended under the strain. The defense also tried to reintroduce the idea of other suspects, pointing to Columbia's transient student population, but the argument lacked traction. The retrial was shorter, less theatrical, but no less intense. Jesse's friends and family filled the courtroom, their presence a silent demand for justice. The police department, still reeling from the scandal, kept a low profile, though whispers of internal reforms circulated. After a week of testimony, the jury deliberated for 8 hours. On June 12, 2008, they returned a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder, a lesser charge, with an additional 23 years for armed criminal action. Rios was sentenced to life, but with parole eligibility in 2035, a small concession that left Joan Valencia furious. "It's not enough," she told reporters, her voice breaking. "My son is gone forever." Rios was transferred to the South Dakota State Penitentiary, a move prompted by safety concerns given his former status as a cop. He maintained his innocence, writing letters to supporters claiming the evidence was circumstantial. Libby and her parents stood by him, launching a small online campaign to raise doubts about the case, but for most in Columbia, the verdict felt like a compromise, a step toward justice, but not the full measure Jesse deserved. The murder of Jesse Valencia and the conviction of Stephen Rios left Columbia, Missouri, forever changed. For Jesse's family, the pain of his loss was a wound that would never fully heal. Joan Valencia, his mother, became an advocate for victims' rights, speaking at vigils and memorials to keep her son's memory alive. "Jesse was my light," she said at a 2009 event, tears in her eyes. "He wanted to make the world better, and I'll carry that for him." Friends established a scholarship in Jesse's name at the University of Missouri, ensuring his passion for law and journalism lived on, a small beacon of hope amid the grief. For the Columbia Police Department, the case was a reckoning, Rios's actions exposed vulnerabilities. How had a cop with a double life gone unnoticed? The department implemented new oversight measures, including stricter background checks and mandatory ethics training, though some officers felt the changes were too little, too late. The scandal eroded public trust, with residents questioning whether justice was blind when one of their own was involved. The Columbia Daily Tribune published exposes on police accountability, sparking debates that lingered for years. Rios's supporters, led by Libby and her family, continued to proclaim his innocence, pointing to the overturned first conviction and the lack of a murder weapon. They argued the DNA was inconclusive and that the prosecution leaned too heavily on Rios's affair and emotional instability. A small website, Free Stephen Rios, shared their perspective, though it gained little traction. Most in Columbia saw the evidence as overwhelming: the DNA, the phone calls, the suicide attempts, and believed justice had been served. However imperfectly, the case left a deeper mark on the community's psyche. Students at Mizzo, especially in the LGBTQ community, held annual vigils for Jesse, using his story to advocate for acceptance and safety. The lawn on Wilson Avenue, once a crime scene, became a quiet memorial with flowers left each June 5th. But the questions lingered: could the police have acted faster? Was Rios truly the calculated killer prosecutors described, or a man pushed to the edge by circumstance? The case became a cautionary tale about power, secrets, and the fragility of trust. As we close this story, reflect on Jesse Valencia, young man whose life was stolen, whose dreams were silenced by a single act of violence. His story reminds us that behind every crime are real people, real pain, and real consequences. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of Missouri's most haunting true crime cases. If you're moved by Jesse's story, hit subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me, what do you believe happened that night in June 2004? And what does this case say about the systems we rely on? Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.